Good morning, and thank you for tuning in to The Global Current. I'm Morgan Mount.
And I'm Liam Scollins.
Today in news, a suicide bombing kills several people in St. Petersburg, Russia.
Israel continues with its settlements in Palestinian territory.
And mudslide kills at least 230 people in Colombia.
In analysis, the Trump administration signals policy shifts on human rights.
And in an in-depth look at how Russia will respond to international terrorism following the St. Petersburg bombing.
Then, an excerpt from Seton Hall professor Dr. Yanzhong Huang's discussion of China's global leadership. Dr. Huang is the director of the Center for Global Health Studies and regularly publishes reports and articles on the topic of global health.
And now Yilin Du reports on the St. Petersburg bombing.
On Monday, April 3rd at 2:40 p.m., an explosion occurred at the train station of St. Petersburg, Russia. According to the New York Times, the explosion occurred when the train was in the tunnel between two stations. The bomb is a homemade device that is made with shrapnel. The bombing killed 11 people and injuring 40 or more people, including children. According to Fox News, there are two different explosion devices, one of which exploded in the train while the other one was planted in the nearby station. Before the second bomb explodes, the crew has separated the explosion device. President Putin was in the city of St. Petersburg on the day of the bombing. He addressed the bombing in a press conference.
Unfortunately, we have to start our meeting with this tragic event. The cause is still unclear. It's too early to say. There will be an investigation, but we're always looking into all possible causes, including criminal and terrorism. The investigation will start and identify the cause of the tragedy.
According to the New York Times, the bomb torn through the third car on the train. St. Petersburg is the second largest city in Russia, and the train station has a people flow of over 2 million per day. The New York Times states that, according to Russian news report, suicide bombers who belong to a militant Islamic group may cause the bombing. Currently, no terrorist group has claimed responsibility for the bombing. Political analyst Kirill Rogov believed that the terrorists may have planned the attack due to Putin's 2015 decision to send military troops to Syria. Rogov said if somebody announced that it is related to the Russian invasion in Syria, it would be a sensitive scenario for Putin, because the Syria campaign would lose support inside Russia. According to Fox News, President Trump has called Putin to express condolences to those who are involved in the incident and offers full help to find justice and promote peace. United States Ambassador at the United Nations, Nikki Haley, posted on Twitter, "We would like to extend our condolences to the people of Russia. We stand with you on defeating these extremist groups who continue to cause senseless harm against innocent people." This is Yilin Du from The Global Current.
Up next, Santiago Losado reports on Israel's continued construction of settlements in Palestinian territory.
For the first time in more than 2 decades, Israel's government has approved the establishment of new settlements being built. On March 30th, the government laid the groundwork for further expansion despite President Trump's request to delay such plans. President Trump met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House last month and discussed the moves that Israel took in order to approve thousands of new housing units in the occupied West Bank. A statement from the White House characterizes Israeli plans as an obstacle obstructing peace between Israel and Palestine. For Mr. Netanyahu, he is simply following through with the promise he had made to 40 settled families after building a new community for them. These new settlements could be a cause for concern. Under previous American administrations, and because of the peace efforts with the Palestinians, Israel refrained from establishing new settlements. According to the New York Times, the settlements are meant to be built in the Shiloh area of the West Bank, a location which cuts across the West Bank. Some critics believe that this location could be seen as a bid to prevent Palestinian-controlled territory. Mr. Netanyahu also believes that the new settlements are not the most important aspect of the conflict.
I believe that the issue of the settlements is not the core of the conflict, nor does it really drive the conflict. I think it's an issue. It has to be resolved in the context of peace negotiations. And I think we also are going to speak about it, President Trump and I, so we can arrive at an understanding, so we don't keep on bumping into each other all the time on this issue, and we're going to discuss this.
Construction of new settlements has both supports and detractors. The Conservative Review reports that the only resolution of international law prohibiting new settlements is the 1922 Mandate for Palestine from the time of the League of Nations, later called the Jewish People's Clause under the UN Charter. With this clause as evidence, the modern Palestinian state is the modern state of Jordan, because it already took in the majority of the land from the original Mandate of Palestine that was allocated to the Jewish state under the first Mandate of Palestine. As of now, the international community currently sees all Israeli settlements in Palestinian territories as illegal, and as a major obstacle to peace. Zewa reports that these new settlements are really important for the Israeli government, and especially for Mr. Netanyahu, because he needs to keep his government together. Mr. Netanyahu has been leaning towards conservative movements in Israel as a means of promoting unity since his re-election as Prime Minister. For the Global Current, this is Santiago Losada.
Next this morning, Adeline Patterson brings us a report on mudslides in Colombia.
According to CNN, the provincial capital of Mocoa, located in the Putumayo province of southwestern Colombia, was affected by a disaster caused by a torrential downpour beginning on the night of March 31st. The heavy rainfall caused the Mocoa, San Boyaco, and Malata rivers to overflow, all of which border the town of Mocoa. The combined overflow of these rivers created a fatal landslide that wreaked havoc throughout the city. BBC reports that the landslides began in the early hours of Saturday morning while residents slept. These deadly floods destroyed homes, buried cars, separated families, and decimated the landscape. According to BBC, rescue services report that the disaster hit 17 neighborhoods and destroyed at least 25 homes, including the home of Mocoa's mayor, Jose Antonio Castro. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, Mocoa lacked electricity, clean water, and other utilities. On Sunday, the Colombian Red Cross claimed at least 234 people have died as a result of this natural disaster, but a definite number is difficult to pin down. According to BBC, some local media outlets expect the total death toll may be closer to 300. It is estimated that 220 people are missing and many more have been left injured. According to CNN, a task force of over 1,000 soldiers and national police officers were dispatched to search for survivors, but they are facing many obstacles. Some of these obstacles include the storms that continue in the region, the limited mobility on roads, and the amount of upturned land that resulted from the mudslide.
No health services, no psychosocial support, no shelter, no food assistance, and all the livelihood support that they used to have, it's gone.
According to Washington Post, Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos identifies climate change as the source of the issue, stating that the amount of rainfall on the night of the 31st was nearly half the amount the city of Mocoa receives during the entirety of March. CNN reports that during his visit to the stricken city of Mocoa, Santos stated, "Here we are facing a disaster caused by nature, by climate change." BBC reports that Martin Santiago, a senior UN official in Colombia, also blames climate change for the disaster. According to BBC, President Santos declared a state of emergency immediately following the floods. Santos also implored local and national authorities to increase their efforts in the remainder of the rainy season to avoid a similar disaster. For the Global Current, this is Adeline Patterson.
And now, Vincent Maresca brings us a report on how Russia will respond to international terrorism following the St. Petersburg bombing.
On April 3, 2017, at around 2:40 p.m., a bomb detonated between Senaya Ploshad and the Technologiski Institute metro station in St. Petersburg. According to CNN, the Russian investigating committee said a suicide bomber, Akbaryan Dyalilov, a 22-year-old Russian national from Kyrgyzstan, carried out the attack. Authorities also found and defused a second bomb found at another metro station not far from the site of the explosion. The death toll has climbed to 14 people, with many others recovering from injuries. As reported by the New York Times, many of the victims were students and individuals with important plans. Among them were Irina Medyantseva, a middle-aged doll maker, Denis R. Petrov, a wrestling coach, and Maxim Arishev, a Kazakh student. On Wednesday, President Vladimir Putin met with the heads of the security services from the Commonwealth of Independent States. President Putin said the following, quote, "We see that unfortunately the situation is not improving. The recent tragic events in St. Petersburg are the best confirmation of this. We know that each of our countries, practically everyone, is a possible and potential target of terrorist attacks." Unquote. International reaction has been mixed between those sending condolences and those delaying tribute to the lost lives. The White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer, speaking on behalf of President Trump, said of the terroristic attack,
"The president has also been briefed on today's attack at the St. Petersburg metro. The United States condemns this reprehensible attack and act of violence. Our thoughts and prayers are with the injured and with the Russian people as we extend our deepest condolences to the loved ones who have been killed and injured. Attacks like these on ordinary citizens just going about their lives remind us that the world must work as one to combat violence in all forms. The United States is prepared to offer assistance to Russia that it may require in investigating this crime."
Throughout the world, monuments paid homage to the city of St. Petersburg. In Germany, the city of Dresden's Palace of Culture lit up with the colors of the Russian flag. In Tel Aviv, the municipal building also lit up with the tricolor flag. France, while officially showed reluctance to commemorate the loss of lives, nevertheless, after facing public pressure from social media, Mayor Anne Hidalgo ordered the lights of the Eiffel Tower in Paris to turn off. From the beginning of the Russian Federation, terrorism has occurred often due to nationalist insurrections in the Caucasus. Terrorists used fear as a weapon to intimidate the people, and after such attacks occurred, the government issued strong retaliation. BBC News reported that in 2004, the Duma approved President Putin's reforms on the regional governments. From that year on, the president appointed governors from each of the 89 regional governments, and the regional legislators then approved their nomination. This reform allows Putin's central government to exert control over the regions, one of many policies that arose to combat nationalist terror activities. From an international perspective, the latest attack raises doubts on the effectiveness of global war on terror. Are all states on the same page when it comes to fighting terror, or do some utilize tragedy for political gain? Regarding false allegations that the Russian government used the attack as a distraction from the anti-corruption protests of last week, Virginia State Senator Richard Black gave an interview in RT News saying, quote, "It just amazes me that organizations like CNN that literally spent an entire year of 2016 trying to disprove conspiracy theories will go out there and overtly push for a conspiracy theory when it involves Russia." As Black's quote illustrates, many believe the mainstream media of Western nations is not transparent enough in covering the latest terroristic attack. Therefore, they forfeit their credibility in standing up for a free and objective press. Nevertheless, the St. Petersburg subway bombing is a message for all nations to unify under a comprehensive strategy to defeat international terrorism. The Russian Federation has battled a long history of terrorism, and the government benefited from these attacks mainly because it strengthened its resources and tools in combating this form of violence. The Russian government will most likely find another way to rebound in the aftermath of the St. Petersburg metro bombing, regardless of international opinion. This is Vincent Maresca reporting for the Global Current.
Next up, Eric Christotelli reports on changes in the Trump administration's approach to human rights.
Since the Obama administration, the relationship between the United States and Egypt has been strained, particularly after the Arab Spring revolts that saw a militant group take over Egypt. This week, President Trump and Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi met to discuss a wide array of issues, this being the first time the Egyptian president has visited the United States since 2009. These issues vary from the fight against terrorism to the weakened economy of Egypt, and the refugee crisis that continues to deeply affect both nations. Sisi has no doubt in President Trump, especially after the Muslim ban created by Trump. However, it is unlikely that the two leaders will publicly discuss the plight of Aya Hijazi and her husband.
The question really is not whether or not the United States is giving us enough aid to fight against ISIL, because the thing is, when it's carried out, it's the result of a discussion and a dialogue about the requirements to defend Egypt's security and stability.
Hijazi is an Egyptian American who has been incarcerated by the Egyptian regime for nearly 3 years, accused of abusing children she was seeking to help through her nonprofit organization. Those charges are widely viewed as false. The United States under the Obama administration failed to secure the release of Hijazi, although Egypt is the second largest recipient of U.S. military aid, over $1.3 billion per year. Now, Hijazi has become a symbol of the sharp shift in U.S. policy by the Trump administration towards Sisi, an illustration of prioritizing security cooperation over human rights concerns and engagement with authoritarian leaders. The story of Hijazi and her husband is a single example of widespread repression that has spread throughout Egypt under Sisi. The White House has not publicly addressed Egypt's human rights abuses, which the State Department has said include the suppression of free speech, torture, forced disappearances, and lack of due process. After Sisi seized power in 2013, reports of police brutality, arbitrary detentions, tortures, disappearances, and death sentences were abundant. The worst of the Sisi regime's crimes was to be the public massacre of at least 817 people, conducting sit-down protests in Cairo's Rabaa al-Adawiyya Square and al-Nada Square. Human rights advocates offer a grave assessment of Trump's approach. President Trump says he wants to focus bilateral talks on security, but what drives insecurity in Egypt is the government's harsh repression, said Neil Hicks, Director of Human Rights Promotion at Human Rights First. When human rights are not protected, instability fuels the very extremism that President Trump says he is trying to combat. If President Trump fails to raise the human rights concerns with President Sisi, is by definition undermining the global struggle against terrorism and violent extremism. Human rights groups are urging the Trump administration to consider Hijazi, as well as the tens of thousands in prison, before sending more assistance to Egypt. In addition to the visit from Sisi, Chinese President Xi Jinping will visit the United States on Friday. Both the United States and China desire cooperation on a plethora of issues, including climate change. However, human rights watchdogs have voiced their concerns about President Xi. They accuse Xi of leading a crackdown on dissenters and expanding the Communist Party's reach into Chinese society, especially in the fields of academia and journalism. What are the implications from a policy shift in the Trump administration? Trump administration officials have suggested that inserting human rights concerns into disputes will forestall any efforts for cooperation with nations like China and North Korea. By foregoing the human rights issue, Trump is open to maintaining Bashar al-Assad as the leader of Syria, even though he has faced accusations of using chemical weapons. Mona El-Tahawi, an Egyptian author and critic of Sisi, said, "The Trump administration is willing to overlook human rights violations and fascism, basically for the sake of its own interests." Therefore, what is the impact on international human rights? The decision to overlook human rights when dealing with other nations has led many to question the actions of President Trump. In searching for security, is it right to disregard the human rights of other individuals? Previous presidents have shunned nations that ignored or actively violated human rights. But with President Trump apparently changing his stance, is it possible that the United States is ending its role as a protector of liberal values and human rights? While this question lacks a definitive answer at this time, the trajectory of the U.S. appears bleak. In its absence, other nations, international institutions, and non-governmental organizations rise to the challenge of protecting and expanding human rights agenda worldwide. This is Eric Christotelli reporting for the Global Current.
Finally this morning, we bring you an excerpt from Seton Hall professor Dr. Yanzhong Huang's discussion with Seton Hall students on the topic of China's role in global leadership. This discussion is a part of the April Brunch series hosted by the School of Diplomacy and International Relations.
So, okay, let's talk about something more formally. That's China's, that is the prospect of China being the global leader. And I want to write a piece on that for a couple of weeks, actually, since February, when I attended that panel at the International Studies Association meeting in Baltimore. Whether the panel, we have John Mearsheimer was also on that panel. You guys all probably know that who John Mearsheimer is. Was a professor at the University of Chicago. He was my professor there, and the leading scholar of the neorealism. Actually, he is like, when people talk about neorealism, well, he is now the person associated with that school of thought. So he, I pointed out, and he was happy to hear that. They said China's international ascendance seems to fit perfectly well the predictions of neorealist scholars like John Mearsheimer, because he was basically talking about, right, China more powerful, right? It's going to compete with the United States for leadership, right? The United States should try its best to contain China's rise, but he was also predicting this tragic of great power, right? The politics, inevitably, there will be confrontation, if not war, between the two countries. Right? So he focused on basically on the structural conditions, right? How the changing balance of power. Right? Doesn't matter whether China wants a peace or not. Doesn't matter whether U.S. wants a peace or not. It's all about the distribution of power, right? If you upset the balance of power, but their efforts, their forces try to restore that balance, right? So that process, right, very often can lead to tensions, confrontations, and even war, right? So this is the trap. The Chinese leaders now are very familiar with that. They're called Thucydides' trap, right? Emerging nations will inevitably changing the leadership status of the status quo powers, right? And that process is often not peaceful. So back to 1974, Chinese paramount leader Deng Xiaoping actually declared at the United Nations that, I quote, "China is not and will never become superpower." But guess what? Right? Today, more and more Chinese scholars they're convinced that China is already a superpower. I just met that guy a couple of weeks ago, who's the dean of the Peking University's School of International Relations, and also a member of the standing committee of the Chinese CPPCC. That's sort of like China's up house. He has no problem using this term, superpower, to describe China's power status. So this is the result of the changing structural context. The structural conditions changed. But I also point out that there's also this new strategic context. So it's not just a structural context. There's also changes in the strategic context in terms of the actions, preferences, choices, moves made by the decision makers of both countries, U.S. and China, right? That is, of course, unfolded with the election of the Donald Trump as the U.S. president, right? the new president, right, he despised the liberal world order. Right? And his American first approach actually alienated, if not offended, many other international leaders that generates this demand for alternative global leadership. Right? I was reading the New York Times report about global health that just a couple of days ago. They said the U.S. is now at the crossroads, for global health aid because until now we spend like $9 billion a year just on global health. About foreign aid, we spend about 1% of the GDP on foreign aid. Well, that is certainly that's not what many ordinary people think. They thought that we spent like a quarter of our GDP on foreign aid. That is certainly not true, misperception. But even that, that Trump is considering, right, that cut the foreign aid, even our allied, the commitments, right, to our allies. Basically they want them to show them more responsibilities, right, instead of just the U.S. provide the security umbrella, right, for essentially allow those countries to free ride, right, on U.S. efforts. And this is what the John Mearsham and Steve Ward, another my professor at Chicago, who teaches at Harvard, Steve Ward, that is another very famous scholar in the field. They use that term offshore balance, right, to describe the new U.S. strategy, toward the allies. Have you heard of this term, offshore balance? Offshore balance basically, simply speaking, is that the United States is not going to intervene directly, right, in the conflicts, tensions, that between its allies and the other countries like in East Asia, right? Instead, they will ask the allies to pay more, to do more, right, in dealing with like a rising threat like China, and the U.S. will be like a last resort. Okay, so this is called offshore balance. We're going to rely on them, not us, right, to balance a rising power. The demand side is that there's increasing demand for alternative global leadership. In fact, the UN Secretary General, the Antonio Guterres, right, the new SG. He was praising China for assuming a clear leadership in multilateralism in today's world. And yesterday, I met the Director of Policy and Advocacy of MSF. The Director of Policy and Advocacy went on to see me. We had a 1-hour discussion. Basically, he said, I want to know more, in this under the new administration of Trump, this potential retreat from global affairs, how China could play alternative leadership role in foreign aid in terms of global health. So there's that expectation actually increasing internationally. And on the supply side, right, we also seen some, I won't say sea change, but the significant change in terms of Chinese attitude toward engagement in global affairs. Just 10 years ago, I remember I had a debate with at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, a debate with Jack Cho. Because Jack Cho was basically arguing that China should chip in more, that should shoulder more responsibilities. I said that might take time. It's not going to be that easy. I was like on the conservative side because at that time, many of the Chinese, including the Chinese policymakers, thought this call for China to shoulder more responsibilities. International affairs was like a plot of the Western countries, with like ulterior motives, trying to slow down China's development, So that was basically the thinking of the Chinese leaders at that time, 10 years ago. But now, guess what? Well, just this year, right? In January, a senior Ministry of Foreign Affairs official indicated that China might be forced to assume the role of the global leadership if the United States steps back from that position. Basically said if the United States want to vacate that seat of global leadership, we can fill the role. We have no problems doing that. And Xi Jinping, in his speech in Geneva and Davos, he also played this role like it's a champion for globalization. He talk about he's criticized the protectionism and isolationism, I guess targeting Trump, right? He talked about the democratization of international relations. That is kind of interesting because China is not a democracy yet, but they have no problems talking about democratization of international relations. He's pledged to continue honoring the Paris climate deal at a time when Trump basically say this global warming is like the conspiracy of the Chinese, and he's called for countries to work together to address global governance challenges. So this is all, like the antithesis of Trump. So that I found very impressive. But the question, as I presented at ISA, is that whether China has even though it has the will, whether it has indeed the capacity, the capability, right, to fill that void left by the United States, if the United States indeed is no longer interested in playing that leadership role.
Thank you so much for your comments, Dr. Huang. Dr. Huang is a professor of international relations at Seton Hall University, as well as the director of the Center for Global Health Studies.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of The Global Current. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm Morgan Mount.
And I'm Liam Scollins.
Keep it current with The Global Current.
The Global Current is brought to you by the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Our executive producer is Liam Scollins. Our associate producer is Morgan Mount. Our news editor is John Chadeau. Our analysis editor is Marissa Hutton. Our technical producer is Trevor West. And our social media coordinator is Maddie Ruth. The Global Current theme song is Acid Jazz by Kevin MacLeod. You've been listening to The Global Current on WSOU 89.5 FM, Seton Hall's Pirate Radio.